You may win this vote, and Amy Coney Barrett may become the next Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. But you will never, never get your credibility back. These words were said by Chuck Schumer, a minority Democrat leader. Now, what he was talking about was the recent appointment of Amy Coney Barrett as a new Supreme Judge. This is, in essence, not really controversial in any sense. The president, or in this case Trump, appointing a new Supreme Judge really isn't that uncommon and shouldn't really be a cause of concern. In fact, it's a part of his job. However, there was a lot of controversy surrounding it, and it had to do with the fact that it was done right before the next election, and the Supreme Judge that was in fact appointed was quite an outspoken Republican. So this controversy leads us to a question. Is Trump a bad leader for doing this? And should this behavior be allowed to happen?
And these are exactly the questions that we'll try to answer today as we discuss the Trump and the separation of power. To start, we just want to quickly go over the different topics that we'll discuss during this presentation. We'll go over the background of the US system, just to kind of understand the basics of it. We'll discuss whether Trump's presidency can be described more as authoritarian. We'll discuss the example of the 2018-2019 government shutdown. And we'll try to answer, are Trump's actions a reason for concern, or are his actions uncommon? Have they happened in the past? We'll start with the background. What is the separation of powers? It was created. It was a thought that was created by Montesquieu in the 18th century, a French philosopher during the Enlightenment age. And basically, the idea was that the government should, according to Montesquieu, should be separated into three powers: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. The idea behind this separation was that none of the branches would be able to gain predominant power in the government and overpower the other two. A legislative branch would focus on the president in the form of the Congress in the US or in the form of parliaments in other countries. The executive branch is represented by the head of state or the head of government, and the judiciary is represented by the courts and, for example, the Supreme Court in the US.
The founding fathers were heavily inspired by Montesquieu. Now, they would often quote him, in fact, particularly when criticizing the Articles of Confederation, which were in place before the Constitution was drawn up and was enacted. Now, the main criticism was that the Articles of Confederation had no separation of powers. What this basically implied is that the president was chosen by the Congress, usually done by the executive branch, or at least the president would usually be part of the executive branch. Congress would settle disputes among states, which nowadays, under a tripartite system, is usually done by the Supreme Court. And Congress would enact wars as well. Now, the founding fathers were very scared of this because what could basically happen is that if members of Congress would have differing personal interests from those of the people, they could and had the power to prioritize those interests above the interests of the people. And according to the founding fathers, this would create a tyrannical rule. This really is the reason why in the first three articles of the Confederation, so the first three articles that were actually drawn up, these articles would describe this separation. Now, this separation was made up into three branches. And the first article describes the legislative branch. This legislative branch is fulfilled by Congress and the Senate. In this case, the Congress makes the bills and is in fact the only chamber that is actually allowed to make bills, which are then by the Senate. If the bill passes through the Senate, it then goes on to the president, which we'll get on later. And after that, it becomes an actual law. Now, this branch is actually often expected to have the most power in the US due to them being able to impeach the president, which we'll get on later as well as historically being seen as the most powerful due to the history of the US. Since, as I mentioned before, in the times of the Articles of Confederation, Congress held a lot of power when actually making sure that the laws being enacted are actually being followed. You have the judicial branch. This is fulfilled by the Supreme Court. and their task is basically to interpret and apply the laws that Congress has made and have been passed. Now, another interesting thing is that in the US, this judicial branch has become very partisan over the last century. What you often see is that supreme judges get characterized by mostly on the political party they are affiliated with. And this can, for example, be seen as in the example I mentioned earlier regarding the appointment of Comey Barrett, who, as mentioned before, was very much known to be a Republican, replacing Ruth Ginsburg, which was a Democrat. Now, lastly, we have the executive branch, which is led by the president. It controls the foreign diplomacy, the military, and enforces the general things that he was elected upon. This is done by appointing cabinet members to oversee certain governmental roles, as well as making executive orders in order to fill these tasks. Now, the president in the US is voted in by the people and is held accountable by Congress, who can start impeachment, who in the worst case can start impeachment procedures against the president. The last part, which is very interesting, is that he has veto power over the legislature. This means that if a bill passes through Congress and Senate, and he still has, the president still has the power to not get these laws enacted and simply refuse to sign these bills, which becomes interesting when considering Trump.
And now we move on to the Trump's part of the presentation, where we will discuss whether his presidency can be described as an authoritarian or a democratic one. Throughout his many of different actions that he has taken can be described as authoritarian, and throughout his presidency, there are many examples of Trump butting heads with the different actors in the government. However, many of these examples can be seen from two sides. For example, despite him, while he inserts individuals who represent his agenda into higher institutions, such as the recent nomination of Amy Coney Barrett into the Supreme Court, it can be argued that he does it to ensure that the interests of his supporters, his electorate, is being fulfilled. Furthermore, he pushes mediation. However, in the light of many different issues with the fake news and them being a big issue in the current society. He also is often argued. It's often presented. He's often presented as an authoritarian leader because he openly critiques and attacks those who oppose him or who oppose his policies and actions. This can be obviously viewed as an authoritarian characteristic. However, it can also be a sign of a strong leadership. Lastly, he did. There is obviously an example of him intervening in democratic processes, such as the Mueller investigation, when he used his executive privilege to stop the Congress from accessing the full Mueller report, which essentially possibly could have saved him from being impeached. However, that is something that we can only speculate. But he did it while it seeming like an authoritarian action and thing to do. He did it in accordance to law. He used tools that were given him by the system. One reason that it can be given as a reason for concern, one event, is the 2018-2019 government shutdown. The government shutdown took place between the December 22nd and 2018 and January 25th, 2019, and took 34 days and was the longest government shutdown in the history of US, and actually the second one during Trump's presidency. The impasse was started between the Congress and Trump, as the new appropriations bill was being proposed. However, it did not include any funding for the wall. What followed was a 34 days of a government shutdown, finally ending in January 25th when a 3-week fund bill was proposed, who would help the government stand up on its feet. And officially on February 15th, Trump signed the new spending bill. And however, the bill still didn't include any sort of funding for the wall. In face of which, Trump decided to declare national emergency, in hopes to gain access to additional funds to follow with his agenda. So what is interesting is that both people from both sides, both from the Democratic and the Republican sides, argued that it was were mostly in agreement that it was Trump who was solely responsible for the shutdown, and that he should not have focused so much on his agenda of building the wall. Now, the question that is being raised here is this behavior uncommon? Has this happened in the past, or is our actions of Trump something new, something that people couldn't have possibly been expecting, or is it something that's already happened in the past? When it comes to the president using his power in order to follow his agenda and follow the interests of his voters, that is something that is very common in politics and characteristic of pretty much every president, U.S. president. Similar with many different voices arguing that the executive orders are being used to the extent by Trump. As we can see on the graph on the monitor, Trump hasn't really been doing as way more executive orders than his predecessors, especially people like Carter, Reagan. Which actually shows that he is not really using his power to the extent he's overextending his executive power. Also, very interestingly, the impeachment process can be argued that it's not as big of a deal as it may be portrayed to be, because when we look at the actual statistics, 3 out of 4 impeachment processes that almost took place happened in the last 50 years, which proved to be a minuscule period when we compare it to the over 100 years between the first impeachment process of Johnson and the almost impeachment process of Richard Nixon. It's also interesting and important to underline that it's not that this kind of behavior is not really a Republican characteristic. It also happened to many different Democratic leaders have also used their power to follow their agenda. The example is of Roosevelt, who instead of a unofficially agreed upon 2 terms of presidency, decided to go for 4 and managed to do so successfully. This and all those discussions, whether this behavior is uncommon, is it authoritarian, lead us to one ultimate question, which is
What is of whether using your seats to push an agenda is a process that is uncommon in the US? Well, honestly, it is not. When looking at a reason for why, a good way to reason for why this would happen is that in the end, Trump's aim is to fulfill enough of his campaign promises to get reelected. He does this in a way that isn't necessarily politically correct, but in the end, he does try to ensure that the interests of his voters are well ensured. So if you were to answer the question of whether it's a cause for concern that could lead to a potential constitutional crisis, we are quite troubled, and we do think it is a cause for concern. The thing we are wondering, however, is whether it has to do with Trump or whether it actually has to do with a more structural problem within the Constitution. What we really do wonder is whether it is truly just Trump being Trump, or whether it is actually a more deep problem with the way that the US government is structured to have a separation of powers. All of these thoughts led to a final question on which you all can debate, which is whether Trump is a good leader by using loopholes to support the interests of his voters. We are looking forward to the discussion, and that is the end of our presentation.
thank you very much for watching.